to have the 39th Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur L. Ross Jr. with us today. Of course, Secretary Ross is the principal voice of commerce of business in the Trump administration, ensuring that U.S. entrepreneurs and businesses have the tools they need to create jobs and economic opportunity. And Secretary Ross is, of course, well known as a man with over a half-century experience in investment banking and private equity, restructuring over $400 billion in assets in industries too diverse to list today, and serving as chairman or lead director of more than 100 companies in over 20 countries. As chairman and chief strategy officer of W.L. Ross & Company, LLC. He is a longtime friend of Hudson Institute. He is also the only person, more importantly, elected to the Private Equity Hall of Fame and the Turnabout Management Hall of Fame. He's been decorated by the governments of South Korea and Japan, among others. When you look at his bio and when you chat with him, you realize this is a man who has led an absolutely extraordinary life in every dimension, and he is now dedicating himself with the same insight, same energy, same force of personality to public service. And fortunately for those of us interested in the area of space and the future of space travel and the future of space satellite communication, he is taking the lead on the potential on this important area, and he fully grasps the potential for private sector space travel and exploration. His goal is nothing short, and I quote him, to make the United States the flag of choice for space launches and space activities. Of course, he serves on the National Space Council, which is chaired by Vice President Pence, whom, as I mentioned earlier, is another longtime friend of Hudson Institute. The Vice President has delegated to the Commerce Department responsibility for overseeing increased government cooperation with commercial space industry and easing related regulations. This requires a different kind of restructuring than the kind that you've done over 55 years in industry, but this being government, it requires someone of your talents, as it were, to reform the structures governing space situational awareness, space traffic management, and broader space policy. Delighted to have you in conversation today, and especially delighted to have you in conversation with Hudson Institute fellow Brandt Pasco, who leads our Space 2.0 initiative. Brandt is an attorney by training. He's the former Associate General Counsel of In-Q-Tel. He has had long and distinguished government service of his own at the Department of Homeland Security and at the Department of Transportation. He served on numerous federal advisory boards at the Department of State and at the Commerce Department, particularly at the Defense Trade Advisory Group at the Department of State and the Regulation, Procedures, and Technical Advisory Committee at the Department of Commerce. I know all of us are looking forward to what will be an absolutely fascinating conversation, so let's give Secretary Ross a warm Hudson Institute welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. If I can address a small housekeeping matter before we start our conversation, Mr. Secretary. The Secretary has agreed to take some questions at the end. We ask that they be kept topical to the subject of space policy. And one of my colleagues has cards, and we'd like questions to please be written and passed down to the end, and someone will collect them and bring them up, and we'll try to get people's questions addressed. But thank you for your cooperation in that. So, Mr. Secretary, thank you again for joining us today. We're really pleased to have you here. It's a great honor, and it's nice to be able to chat with you again. Goodness, the topic of space, right? There's such a dynamic area and so many things going on. And if you look back over the changes just in the last 15 years, right, where things were overwhelmingly focused on purely telecommunications. And now we see capital going into all sorts of areas, every conceivable facet from space transportation, yes, of course, telecoms, but imagery, looking towards manufacturing, prospect. I mean, the list of areas is just explosive. I guess it would be interesting to have your perspective on why this all is important, what it means for the United States, where you see this going.
Sure. Well, first of all, as to the explosion of activities, I think that's a natural consequence of two things. One in the beginning, the whole objective was get there, learn something about what was there. Now, as it becomes a little more mature, the exercise becomes, well, now we're there. What do you do with it? How do you make something out of it, something useful, something constructive? So I think it's the logical next phase, as are the support functions. Having all these satellites out there means there's a resupply needed, means there's maintenance needed, means all kinds of things are needed. So it will in turn spawn quite a lot of support industries, let alone all the new applications of it. To me, the most novel new application, or relatively new one, is Richard Branson has signed up 600 people who have prepaid $250,000 each. That's $150 million for a 20-minute ride into space. It's the beginning of space tourism. And it's extraordinary to me that there's so much interest that he's able to accomplish that. That to me is the tip of the iceberg of another whole new set of activities that eventually leads to colonization, eventually leads to space manufacturing, eventually leads to space mining, leads to all kinds of potential activities.
It's fascinating. So then that leads naturally to a second question, right? Where this extraordinary level of entrepreneurship that we're seeing unfold. What is your vision for how the Commerce Department and the U.S. government as a whole can foster and facilitate all of this?
Sure. Well, it's really essential that we do, because in the present budget-constrained environment, if we don't have huge participation by the private sector, we're not going to get anywhere.
No, that's right.
So this is not just something that'd be nice to do with private sector. It is absolutely essential that we do it with private sector. To encourage private sector, we need to make some different policies from what we've had. Space regulation is basically obsolete. Much of the enabling rules are 20 or more years old. Well, the space world of today bears very little resemblance to what it did 20 years ago, and 20 years from now it'll bear probably very little resemblance to what we have today. So we need a space regulatory environment where the pace of regulatory change matches the space of technological innovation. So far, there's been a terrible gap between the two. Second, we need to think through the importance of quick decisions. One of the things I learned in private sector, a quick no is often much more valuable than a really slow yes, because the really slow less interferes with decision-making and planning and things like that. So we've adopted some new things. We've cut for the remote sensing, which is one of our main regulatory activities, cut the time to get a license from over 200 days to an average of about 90 days. Now that's probably still too long, but at least it's a big improvement from where it had been. We've also initiated some other ideas, such as had been every time you did a launch with a camera, even though it was the same launch vehicle, same camera as last time, you had to go through the whole regulatory process. Why? So what we've now put in is a concept, if it's the same everything, there's a time period during which your authorization prevails, regardless whether you just do one launch or 5 or 10 or whatever number. So simple-minded, if you will, terrestrial observations, how to make the regulatory process smoother. trying to create a whole of government approach is another thing. It's kind of fragmented now. We're doing a fair amount to consolidation of it, but there's still pieces that are not all in one place. And as we absorb other pieces, there will obviously have to be transition periods so that the change is seamless. For example, we're taking over a big role in space situational awareness and space traffic management. Air Force will be the one who primarily does it, but their mission is a very precisely defined one. All the interaction with private community, all the developments that are necessary for private community are not really their focus, they're not really their province, so there's room for us there, including in technological change. At present, there's only measurement of objects. There's 600,000 objects floating around out there. Only 10 or 12,000 of those are 10 centimeters or more in diameter. And yet the smaller ones can do an awful lot of damage to a solar panel. So taking the universe of objects down in size and up in number is one of the objectives that we will have. Second thing is working with private sector, developing algorithms to refine our capability to determine probability of collision is an important thing. So there are lots of things like that that are needed to make it more user-friendly, more adaptable to commercial sector. And so those are some of the areas we'll be trying to pursue in the STM and SSA.
That's very helpful, thank you. So as we're looking at this really dynamic commercial marketplace and as it's evolving and growing with a tremendous amount of venture capital and private equity flowing into things, do you see that there are particular areas where the United States has a natural competitive advantage with respect to other countries?
Well, I think in anything to do with semiconductors and software, we clearly are very important leaders globally. We also are gradually developing extreme amounts of experience in launches. So you're starting to see the concept of reusable launch material. A very simple concept, but very hard to execute. Nonetheless, it's been accomplished. And the reason I focus on that is, to me, the key to making space really big, really useful, and really successful is making it less expensive. It costs too much to do a launch, it costs too much to get things up there. So the idea of reusability is a very central one. The idea eventually of having some sort of activity, say on the moon, so that it could be a way station en route to Mars or to some other longer destination in order to take advantage from a payload point of view of only needing the fuel supply initially to get to the moon. And therefore, if you can then refuel on the moon or in some other way that took advantage of lesser gravity, then you can make things more economical. So I think thinking a little bit outside the box is going to continue to characterize the developments here. And frankly, private sector is just better at thinking outside the box than public sector is. There are too many inherently conservative elements to public sector activity that sometimes can inhibit innovation. But if you're a Jeff Bezos and you're writing the check and you're bold and willing to take some risks, much more likely to have a big innovation than a government is, even if we have exactly the same quality of scientists and everybody else. So it's not only essential from an economic point of view, it's also far preferable from an accomplishment point of view to have the private sector interaction.
Well, that's an interesting perspective, and it raises indirectly a question of governance, right? As we see some beginnings of this, right? There's talk of maybe a space force, but to directly link it to your comment, where we're looking at using the moon as a way station, we've mentioned prospecting, manufacturing. Some of this will, of course, be automated, but there are also going to be people out there at various times. And so talk to us a little bit about your perspectives and philosophy on what is the legal infrastructure that we're supposed to be putting into place to govern all of this activity, because there's not a lot of there yet.
No, there isn't. The main thing is the old UN work from, 50 some odd years ago, and not even all countries are signatories to the UN document, but there are now some 70 countries that are actually doing something in space. Now, in some cases, it's just a vanity thing, put a man up there so they can say they did so, but quite a few of them are really serious and want kind of robust programs. So there is going to be more and more competition, if you will, and there's some interesting questions. We believe, for example, that there are lots of minerals, especially valuable metals and rare earths, on asteroids. Well, how do you establish title to them? How do you establish mining rights? Is it first come, first served? Is it the guy with the biggest spacecraft, the guy who puts the first weapons there? How do you establish who's really going to be doing it? Space traffic management. Think how complicated highway traffic management would be in the absence of any police force. Well, there is no police force in outer space. So at present, all one can do is say, beware, that looks to us like there's this object that may be heading toward your satellite, and then perhaps help with an algorithm to determine the probability of that being correct. But if the guy doesn't want to take the advice, there's no mechanism. So one thing is what would be the legal structure, but to me the more fundamental question is legal structure doesn't mean a lot if there isn't some sort of enforceability to it, and that's a huge open question. So those are the kinds of things that we will be exploring. Manufacturing, there's already a fellow who took advantage of the fact that a low gravity environment changes the characteristics of materials. And this fellow has created optical fiber cable that supposedly is 1/3 more effective than the existing stuff. And it all came from a little experiment in outer space. Nanotechnology, there's a lot of work being done about nanotechnology in space. A lot of work in pharmaceuticals. All kinds of materials take on different properties when they're in outer space. So we can't even guess just yet how far that will go. But for sure, there'll be lots of commercial fallout from it. And interesting questions, how do you then commercialize that? So there'll be a lot of work done in all of those areas. Very complicated question now. As you know, 2024 is supposed to be the privatization in some form of the SSL. Well, what does that really mean? How do you do it? How do you protect the national interests? How do you deal with the commercial interests? And how do you really make it an economical thing for people to do? Those are all big challenges, and for the moment, unsolved questions.
So that then leads perhaps to another natural question. We talk a lot about, well, today we've talked a lot about the commercial aspects of space and the fact that this is already a multi-billion-dollar industry and it's only going to become more significant. Going back 20 years ago, much of the discussion on space would have focused on just the national security aspects. And those are, of course, still extraordinarily important.
They surely are. If anything, more important.
So how do you see U.S. leadership in commercial space interacting or affecting those national security concerns?
Well, think about it historically. The jet airplane was invented for military use, and it then became a commercial transformation of the whole transportation industry. So there's plenty of precedent for things that emanated from the military gradually having a very important impact on private sector. But whether Space Force comes into being very quickly or not is outside of our province. But the importance of space from a military point of view, I think, cannot be underestimated. Think about if we're trying to fight a war and somebody figured out how to knock out your GPS, you got a real problem, let alone using the satellites or other things in space as weapons themselves. And I think it was no accident that the Chinese a little while ago deliberately destroyed one of their own satellites. I feel that was more or less, they just wanted to show us they could do it. So protection of both the commercial and the government satellites, military or NOAA or NASA or whatever, those are not going to go away as issues. Those are going to be very big issues. And there probably will be some whole set of industry figuring out how do you protect these very valuable assets. Think about it. If we get to where we have 15,000 satellites up there, multiply that by whatever number you want for cost, that's a heck of a big set of assets up there. And yet for the moment, what is their protection? What is their protection against civilian attack? What is their protection against robust military attack? So the whole national defense question interacts in a very complicated way with the commercialization of space.
Mm-hmm. So then you have a really exciting job right now when you're setting up the, what's been called the one-stop shop, right? And we're still learning what that means. I'd be interested to know a little more about your vision for the Commerce Department and how, it's a complex regulatory environment. You have the FCC, of course, you have a limited bit of DOD, you have FAA, and now Commerce being put up as sort of the one-stop shop. What's your vision for that? How do you see Commerce's role?
Well, as a minimum, we would have the direct functions that are being allocated to us, and we would also try to be the interface, kind of the storefront through which outside commercial parties could participate. So try to coordinate with some of these other agencies. We work with all the other agencies anyway, so that's nothing new. It's just the intensity of our interaction with them is going to grow for two reasons. One, the activity itself is expanding, a lot more units. And second, we're being given more roles. So how it eventually revolves 3, 4, 5 years down the road, that's obviously still a work in progress. But the concept of simplification, the concept of trying to get as close as we can to a one-stop shop, I think those are enduring concepts, and I think they're valid concepts.
So as part of that then, obviously there's a lot that the executive branch can do with its own authority, but some things you need Congress to step up to the plate for. So where do you see where do you see the areas where you really need help from the Congress in order to put this vision into full effect?
Well, right now, as you're aware, there is some pending legislation. Chairman Smith was just here. I assume he probably talked some about what's going on in the Congress right now. But there's a lot of interest in the Congress. There are a lot of congressional people who have a big history with NASA. There are people who have a big history with NOAA, which is part of commerce. And there are people who touch on other aspects, because just as there are the various regulatory entities, so are there various congressional oversight activities. So that's its own complicated situation. And they're threading their way just as we are.
Well, I want to be mindful of your time. I really appreciate you being so generous with us, and I want to be sure that I get to some questions from the audience, so I'll limit myself to just one more. But as a parting, so if there were just one thing that needed to be changed, if you could do one thing and do it now, what do you think would be the thing that should be top priority?
Have unlimited resources.
That's a Congress thing, right? I'm not sure who's the holder of all of the questions from the audience, but if we could get those, and we'll, while they make our
You bring them up.
Have you racked and stacked these at all? All right.
Oh, some more to be collected over here. Sir, over here.
Let's see. I'm trying to see if I can actually
I
read
hope
this.
they'll be edited so they're only easy ones.
Well, I can't read everything on this card, but it has, the general topic is how is the U.S. and its allies going to deal with the growing problem of space garbage?
Well, space debris is a huge problem. Think about it. 600,000 objects going around with nobody driving them. 600,000 objects going at something like 14,000 miles an hour. That's a real problem of debris. It's one of the few times in the world that we confront aggressive debris. Debris really coming at you as opposed to being more or less inert. So that's a whole new set of relatively terrifying experiences. The space situational awareness and space traffic management are meant to try to deal with those issues.
Do you see that there's ever going to be a need to take active measures to clean up the space environment?
Oh, sure, there probably will be. And that could be another whole industry, because if we have 600,000 objects now and we're going to have 10 times as many satellites in a few years, hopefully there won't be 10 times as many objects, but say there are 5 times. That would be 3 million objects now to deal with. That's, even for space, that's starting to get a little crowded to have 3 million things careening around up there.
Well, then this question grows directly from that. What functions within SSA and space traffic management do you consider inherently governmental, given the emergence of commercial markets and products in data collection, processing, and advisory services? So what does the government need to do, and what should be left to industry?
Well, the Air Force is, at least at this stage, the primary collector of the data. So I make the analogy to the National Weather Service. We provide National Weather Service data free, and yet AccuWeather and others have made multi-billion-dollar businesses out of taking what started out life as a free product and commercializing it. I don't see anything logically inconsistent with that happening in space.
Well, so to the extent that activity in space, of course, is regulated, this question goes to the speed of license processing and an apparent lack of staff to handle the volume of work that they have today, much less when we are trying to get 15,000 new satellites launched in the next few years. And I'm sure there would be a lot of interest from industry in knowing what Commerce's plans are to make sure that they have adequate staffing and resources to manage the licensing process.
Well, we have to keep going to Congress with our little tin cup begging for money. That's our strategy.
Well, there may also perhaps be some room for performance-based regulatory processes or general licenses and moving away from...
General licenses I tried to address before. Sure. Once something is a proven, safe, reliable product, there should be a moderation in the amount of paperwork, if any, that's needed for the next application of that individual thing. On the other hand, safety has to be the number one thing. These are very expensive toys. You don't want them to have something bad happen. And particularly as you get to human participation in a larger scale, individual safety becomes even more critical. I think right now the rule of thumb that the government is using is to have a 1 in 279 chance of something untoward happening. Now we can argue, should that be a higher ratio, should it be a lower ratio? But somebody at some point has got to make a decision. What is the tolerance for risk?
So this is perhaps topical to that subject. The question is, will Commerce have an in-house R&D function to support commercial space? An in-house research and development function to support commercial space activity. And I'll combine that with another one that's related, which is basically asking the extent to which the U.S. commercial space activity requires some form of governmental subsidy or support.
Okay, well, there clearly is a role for government in supporting space, particularly the more far out research and development side of things. Projects like the current activities exploring what really is Pluto may be a good case in point in that. There's no immediate obvious commercial use for that information, but I attended a great lecture on it over the weekend and learned some amazing things, and I'll just share a few to illustrate how out of the box it is. I had no idea that Pluto is 1,000 times the size of Earth. 1,000 times. And had no idea that on the North Pole of Pluto, there are 8 recurring octagonal cyclones, each of which is approximately the same in diameter as the Earth. And just think about, these are kind of startling data points. I don't know yet what they mean. No one does. Also, it's largely a gaseous environment under tremendous pressure because of the great pull of gravity. 20 times the pressure at sea level here. Tremendous gravitational pull, which makes it quite hard to orbit around it. And then the last little data tidbit that I'll give you, you've heard lately they discovered some more planets or more moons around Jupiter. Well, it turns out some of them are going clockwise and some are going counterclockwise. How does that come about? That's a counterintuitive kind of a notion. So I don't know what to make of all those things, but just more info about Pluto, as I bet you 5 or 10 years from now, will result in us knowing a lot more about something else that's commercializable. That's sort of the point that I'm trying to make. That kind of far out thing clearly is not going to be economical for private sector to do. The next phase of it, hopefully, would be.
Okay. Well, I want to ask another commercial question. This is combining a couple of them. One of our audience wanted to ask you about the international trade implications for U.S. efforts to dominate space commerce. And that perhaps ties in with another's question on opportunities to collaborate with the European Union on privatization of space, and also someone's question on perhaps dealing with rivals in space like Russia and China.
Well, those are 3 days worth of questions, but anyhow, as to interaction with the other entities elsewhere, there already is a well-established collaboration with the European Space Agency and with some others. There's an opportunity being created right now because the European Commission has informed the UK that they won't be able to participate in Galileo or any of the ESA projects once Brexit comes. So that creates a whole big hole for the UK, and we're probably the most logical partner for them. But we've always had collaboration, and some of it, I think, is not well done. The prior administration basically vacated space launch. So along about 2010-11, we had a 0% market share in space launches. And instead, our government has entered into a series of contracts with the Russians. We're paying the Russians up to $75 million a pop to give a ride for our guys going up to the space station. To me, that doesn't make that's not the right kind of cooperation. We probably funded something like 15 or 20% of the Russian space program. So international collaboration is fine, but it too needs to have some limitations to it.
So then if, obviously looking at the situation we see today, a big part of the solution to not having space launch capability is, goes to this question. It says, record amount of investment capital is flowing to the space sector. And as a former investor, what could put American risk capital at risk of an additional investment? Slightly awkwardly worded, but perhaps you get the gist.
Well, I'll try to interpret it. The actual amount of risk capital, other than from the couple of very well-known, very wealthy people, is fairly limited. It's a few $1 billion a year at recent rates. We have to find a way to multiply that, and multiply that very quickly, because a few $1 billion a year is not going to be adequate to have very rapid achievement of some of these ancillary activities that I described. So we do need more. I think more is starting to come. The European Space Agency has literally spawned a private venture capital fund. Small, it's $100 million, and is just getting itself organized. So we're undertaking to introduce them to Silicon Valley and other providers of capital to start getting some collaboration at that level. But there need to be more, and I think there will be more special purpose firms, more people knowledgeable about space. But more importantly than that, the time horizon between now and when something commercial is feasible has to get shortened, because venture capital funds generally have a 10-year life, and maybe they can be extended a little bit under some circumstances, but they really try to realize things within 3, 4, 5 years. So you need to have some way to get where commercialization is a little closer than it is in some sectors right now. That I think is the other challenge. The other big challenge I mentioned before was making it cheaper to do all these things. So these little CubeSats, constellations, as opposed to a few gigantic ones, that's certainly thinking in the right direction. Frequency of launch is another problem we have to deal with. When you have relatively few launches from a very expensive facility, you have to amortize that base cost over a very small number of launches. Doubling or tripling the amount of launches will have a very big impact on that. And also there should be a learning curve. People in aerospace learned a long time ago, you develop a new plane, that first airplane is ridiculously expensive to build. By the time you get to number 200, much more economical to build. So repetition of production of the key elements is another big factor in bringing costs down. But we got to bring the cost down to make a lot of these activities feasible.
I know we're getting towards the end of our time with you. I have 2 more questions I'd like to run through if we can. First is dealing with spectrum, and I realize that you're not the FCC. We hope to have a forum focused on the FCC in September, so we're going to deal with that also. But whenever we have any kind of discussion on space, it seems like all anyone wants to talk about is spectrum issues. And so the question goes to, what do you see the Commerce Department's role as being in ensuring that space has adequate spectrum to accomplish, if we get to 15,000 satellites, everyone's going to be drinking through a very thin straw.
Well, there are really 2 big dimensions to the spectrum question. The first one is how much of it does government need on its own? And within government, it's the main consumer of spectrum is DOD. So trying to pry loose from DOD and other agencies more bandwidth is one component. The other one then is how do you allocate it? How close together do you permit things to get to be? And those are areas that we better tread pretty carefully, because you really don't want to make mistakes there. There are, as you know, some very active pending cases before FCC right now about proximity of frequency. And the other thing to remember is FCC is an independent agency, and that's not just on paper. It truly is an independent agency, even though it's governmentally appointed. Our role is to provide advice to them, but we cannot, in commerce, and mostly through NTIA. So we can advise them, we can make arguments, we can try to work with them, but they will, at the end of the day, make the determination.
Okay.
And so it's good that you're having him come. My limited dealings with him, as you know, he's pretty new on the job, seems like a very reasonable, very grounded, very serious person. So while we may or may not agree with all of his decisions, my belief is that they'll be well considered.
Thank you. So the last question here, maybe this is a good one to wrap up on. It says, what in terms of the whole of government concerns you most in the space sector? And maybe that's just an opportunity to say we've been focusing mostly on the Commerce Department, and you've mentioned some other agencies, but what do you see as the overarching administration? What are they trying to accomplish here?
Well, simplification is the thing. DOT, which is responsible for launch and reentry regulation, has been tasked with coming up with a whole new regulatory environment by July of 2019. So that's a whole separate thing that's really quite important. That's afoot. And that's part of the same concept that we have with the other aspects.
Good. Well, thank you. Mr. Secretary, I can't thank you enough for gracing us here at Hudson today. It's been wonderful having your time. There have been a lot of good conversations, and we're really appreciative of you taking the effort to come down.
Well, thank you. Well, I appreciate you folks being in Spain.
Yeah, thank you.